Hi, parents. It's Robbin McManne here. Thank you for listening to Parenting Our Future, which is in the top 0.5% of all podcasts worldwide. Before we dive into this episode, I want to invite you to join my membership site, the Parent Toolbox. You can join this membership for free. It's at www.parent-toolbox.com, and this is the companion site to my show, Parenting Our Future. In the Parent Toolbox, you will find game-changing tools and resources from both myself and my guest experts who are among some of the top minds in the parenting space. There are over 100 resources to help you navigate screen time, co-parenting, meltdown, teenagers, and so much more. Join today at www.parent-toolbox.com. Now back to the show. Hey, everybody, it's Robbin here. Welcome to another episode of Parenting Our Future. I am going to talk to you about some serious stuff today with my guest, some serious conversations that come up that we often don't know how to answer. We don't know how to address with our own kids. And I have somebody really special here who's going to help to make sense of all of this. So I have Dr. Lauren Starnes here, and she's a Senior Vice President and Chief Academic Officer at the Goddard Systems, LLC, which is the franchisor for the Goddard School, if you haven't heard about it. Lauren has more than 20 years experience in education, including curriculum development, evaluation, and implementation, as well as teaching and consulting in the fields of preschool, special needs, and elementary education. And she is the author and an award-winning author at that, with the 2023 Independent Publishing Award winner for her book, Big Conversations with Little Children. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about. So welcome.
Thank you.
So happy to have you here. And I really just want to kind of dive right into this book. I think that a lot of us see the world changing in ways that we have a hard time making sense of. And so when we have to go to explain big things to our kids, it can be really tough. And so let me just back up for a second. What made you write this book to begin with, these big conversations with little children?
Sure. Great question, Robin. So my boys are teenagers now, but when they were 2 and 4 years old, respectively, I was working from home, and my 4-year-old marched into my office one day with Time book, picture of the year, and he slammed the book down on my desk, clearly angry. Little brother right behind him looked me in the face and said, "Mommy, what happened on September 11th?"
Oh,
And I remember looking at the faces of my children who weren't even alive in 2001 when that happened.
yeah.
And I asked him, "What do you think happened on September 11th?" Trying to get context. And he said, "I don't know. I saw the picture and I asked my teacher, and she said we don't talk about that." And so here was my little wide-eyed 4-year-old thinking he'd done something wrong by asking a question. And so I give a very simple explanation. I said, there were planes that crashed into a building and people got hurt, but there were a lot of helpers that day. And my 2-year-old starts laughing and says, "It was an accident." And my 4-year-old turns to him and says, "No, Gavin, things like that don't happen by accident."
Whoa.
And I had an epiphany of, here was my child who'd asked a question and been silenced, thinking he'd done something wrong. Thankfully, I answered the question, and he already had a concept that something really terrible had happened, even at a time in which he didn't exist. I began to keep a journal of topics, questions that my boys asked me that made me pause in my tracks, or things that I encountered in preschools that I supported, where children were exposed to different world events or things in their family or community. And they would ask a teacher, they would ask the school, and the school was struggling at times to know, how do I respond? What do I say when a young child asks a big question?
Oh, wow. And, our kids have such good questions. They have such interesting insights, don't they?
They do.
And that does stop you in your tracks. A lot of the times one of my boys, he's I'll say things and then he'll rebut and I'll be like, man, I never thought of that. I just think,
right. So true.
So, okay. So you really did this based on the kinds of questions that stopped you in your tracks. And this book, Big Conversations with Little Children, you've got over 40 topics. So you were stopped in your tracks pretty often.
Sure. I mean,
Yeah.
again, if you think back as a parent, it's all those questions where our child asked, and either we had emotions, we weren't sure what to say, or we didn't answer the question. I mean, I even as a parent remember times where I kind of dodged we'll talk about that later,
Yeah.
because I wasn't exactly sure what to say given their age and their exposure. And so this is really meant to open up dialogue with our children in a way that they need.
And what do you say when somebody says to a child, well, we don't talk about that? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think the tendency to silence is normal. I think what that really means is that we as adults are questioning ourselves. And some of
Mm,
the questions our children ask us, we ask the world.
mm,
Why did that happen? Why did that happen to that person, that community? How could I have prevented this? I mean, there are all kinds of questions that we don't have answers to. And sometimes I think we as adults are hesitant to say to our children, I don't know. Right? I don't
mm,
know. I don't have the answer. That's scary. I think the other reality is sometimes the questions are political and we're not exactly sure how much we should share or explain to a young child. But oftentimes the questions are emotional. Either it triggers something in us or we ourselves are dealing with the emotion of what's happening. And because we really haven't processed it yet, we simply make the excuse that, well, the child is young, they can't possibly understand, so I'll dodge the question. What we fail to
mm.
realize as parents is when we do that, we often create higher levels of anxiety, worry, and fear in our children, and oftentimes a sense of shame that they did something wrong by asking the question.
Mm. Oh, well, that makes total sense to me. It really does. And we're leaving our kids to figure it out for themselves in all of the innocence that they have and all the ways and the experience that they don't have. So it really means that they're going to come up with an idea that's probably wrong. And again, like you just said, will invite anxiety and shame. And that's not what you ever meant. You never meant that. You never meant
Right.
that. Yeah. So instead, if you don't know, and we're going to talk about some specific areas that we can help our kids with, but if you really don't know, is there a way to just sort of blanket statement say, I'm not sure. Let me go and find out and get back to you? What would you say?
There is. I think it's okay to tell our children that we don't know, that we'll find out. I think it's also okay to say to our children, I don't know why that happened, but here's how I feel about it. And to
Mm,
let our children know that we have emotions as adults too. I mean, children, when they ask questions, they're not just listening for a verbal response, they're looking at our nonverbal. And
yeah.
I think oftentimes, even if we, answer the question, but or express something differently in our facial expressions, it's confusing to children. And so I think
Hmm.
oftentimes the I don't know and then labeling of emotions is the most appropriate way to have the conversation because the
Yeah.
child's likely asking because they also have emotion. Confusion might be one of them, but they also might have sadness or fear based on what they've heard or think that they've heard.
Hmm. Yeah. Wow. That's a really lovely way of handling it. I love that. And I think it's so important that we show our kids that we feel feelings too, and that normalizes it. And it also helps grow emotional intelligence.
It is.
So with that said, here's some hard topics that I want to cover with you. So we're going to talk about a few different things. So how would you talk to a child about a miscarriage, whether it's a recent one, whether it is one that was 10 years ago? The loss of a baby, of a child, that's a significant loss, and it's such a sad topic. How do you bring
It
that
is.
up? How do you
It's a hard topic.
and let me ask you, I think it's sort of two things because maybe your child knows a baby's coming and then the baby doesn't come. But then also, how do you bring it up if your child is 7 or 8 years old and there was a child that didn't make it? Do you bring that up? Do you talk to them about that too? So it's sort of a twofold question.
It is a complicated question. I think at the onset, the easiest way is to address it when the child has a question. Right? That then we
Okay.
know that it's a topic in hand. The child has some sort of information or insight and is seeking more information. It's quite different when we as parents have to think, do I want to get ahead of this topic and bring it up to my child?
Mm,
Um, Miscarriage, if the child is unaware, is very private. I'm not sure how many parents would bring that up naturally to the child. But it could be years later when the child says, why don't I have a brother or sister? Where the parent might perhaps want to share that there was a baby, or not. I think at that point it really depends on the parent's comfort, and the child's age and what the parent knows, like how much can your child handle or conceptualize. We know our children. We know that some topics might be too much for them. The book really focuses on when the child asks the question,
Okay.
and seeks information, because then we're on the spot. We don't have the
Yeah.
choice at that point,
Yeah.
necessarily, because we're being asked.
Okay. And so how do you talk about a miscarriage?
Sure. So I need us to, for the moment, think about the perspective of the child.
Okay.
So I'm a young child. I'm told by my parents that there's a baby on the way. And I, as a young child, work through the emotions. Some children are excited, some aren't quite sure, but I've come to accept it. One thing that young children see is that most often when the information is shared that a baby's on the way, there's excitement. And they see the excitement in the expectant mother. And this is a celebration and a celebratory thing. Fast forward, the child asks about the baby and they're told there is no baby, or they're told, don't ask that question.
Mm.
And the child has a hard time understanding. We were celebrating this a few weeks ago. Why is the question now wrong? And so, one of the most important things to do is when asked is to first pause, because as adults, understandably, miscarriage is a difficult topic, whether you've experienced it firsthand or through friends and family. It's a very difficult topic. But then it's important to ask the child, why, what do you think happened? Get a gauge what the child already understands, is very important because it gives you insight into what they may already know. But then it's important that we do answer the question in very simple, very concrete, and very matter of fact ways. Mommy was going to have a baby. The baby stopped growing, so we're not going to have a baby right now.
Mm.
Very simple. And that way the child understands, okay, there was something to look forward to. Here's what happened and kind of where we are. It's also important to then label emotions for the child. How does that make you feel?
Mm.
Now, the book addresses something that happens frequently, which is the fact that young children lack social and emotional awareness. And the child might say, fine, which as a parent could be very difficult to hear. It's important that when we ask a child how they feel, that we honor and respect their response. And their response might not be what we as adults feel. So the child who says, I'm fine, it is perfectly okay for the adult to say, Mom is really sad. Mom was looking forward to having a brother or sister for you, and we're not going to have the baby right now, and that makes Mom feel sad. It's okay for the child to have their emotions affirmed, but then to share with them that the adult in the situation might have different feelings, and we should label that for the child. And then again, checking with the child, do you have any other questions? Do you think we should do something to help? What are some things that we could do that might make Mom feel better? Whatever it may be, thinking about turning it into action so the child can actually do. The child can't directly impact the miscarriage, but the child can impact comforting, a mother who's mourning. Or the child may have additional questions. Will we have a baby again? And the book addresses that too. Matter of fact, maybe the parents have an answer, maybe they don't. And the answer might be, I don't know. I don't know if we will. We were planning to have a brother or sister for you, and the baby stopped growing, so we're not going to have a baby right now. It's also important that we then reaffirm the child that they are loved, that they are safe, and that they have an important role. Because that way the child can separate themselves from the emotions happening in the family.
Wow. Reaffirming that they are loved and safe. It's beautiful. How important it is that you have something that they can turn into action.
It's a really good idea because it helps the child express how they're feeling. One thing that we know is that young children feel a lot of emotions, but they lack the emotional vocabulary to tell us. Think of the 2-year-old throwing a tantrum. They're
Yeah,
frustrated, they don't know how to tell us, so they act out.
that's right.
So, what we're actually teaching the young child is when I feel something, there are things that I can do. So, the child may say that they feel sad, and we can make some suggestions of things that we do when we're sad or things that might help the child. Would you like to draw a picture? Would you like to put on some music? When I feel sad, I like to listen to music and dance and move my body how I'm feeling, helps me feel better. It also is a way to teach empathy. Can we make a picture for mommy?
Mm.
Should we give mommy some time in the house by herself and maybe we go for a walk? Just things to help the child begin to think about their emotional needs, but also how they can address the emotional needs of others, which is another important developmental skill.
Right. That's a really beautiful idea. I really like that idea. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and one that I hadn't really thought about. So I really appreciate that. Okay, so moving from a miscarriage to something that probably a lot of people have faced, will face, is the death of a pet.
Sure. So death of a pet is generally a child's first exposure to death.
Mm.
If we think about it, the child that loses the goldfish or the hamster that dies or the hermit crab that dies or anything else, death of an animal usually is the child's first exposure to death. And it's also important to realize that for young children, death is usually misconceptualized. If you think
Mm.
about cartoons, the character gets,
Yeah.
I think about Bugs Bunny, the character gets, or Roadrunner, hit by the car and they float in the air and they're back.
Totally
Um,
confusing. Yeah, if
Very
only.
confusing. So we want to avoid any and all euphemisms. Crossing the rainbow bridge, the child will say, great, let's go. Gone to a better place, regardless of faith, the child wants to know where that place is and can they go get the pet. It's important that we explain death for pet very matter of factly. So I need to tell you something very sad that happened. This morning, Fido died, and that means that his body stopped working. So we won't have Fido as our dog anymore. Fido is not coming back. The
Mm.
child has to understand that there's finality in death in terms of physical presence, that they
Mm.
can't go retrieve the animal, that they're gone. And that's important that the child understands that because that's going to elicit different emotions than if they're imagining the road runner floating above the street that's then going to come, running back in the house.
Right. Now, is this a conversation that you have to prepare your child if your animal is sick? Do you ever say, you've got a puppy, let's say, and like, I guess, do you ever prepare them along the way?
I think it's important that children understand that everything living will die.
Mm.
And but also we don't want to scare the child. So with a
Yeah, I know.
puppy, I'm not sure I'd bring about death, but an ailing pet,
Yeah.
when we see that, that the cat is declining, I think it's okay to explain to the child, that the cat is 12 years old and, her body is slowing down and one day her body will stop working and she will die. And when she dies, we will not have her as our cat anymore.
Mm.
If a family abides by faith principles, they may want to talk about what they believe from a religious perspective,
Hmm.
or they may want to leave it very matter of fact. And when she dies, we will bury her. And what that means is preparing the child for what may occur.
Mm.
What often happens with death of a pet is it's unexpected. So the
Hmm.
hamster was fine yesterday and the hamster is not okay today. And so we tend to have the conversation in the moment. And so it's important that we as adults are prepared for that. Having an animal does mean that at some point the animal will likely, precede us in death. And so being prepared to have the conversation with the child, especially with short lifespan animals like goldfish
Hmm.
and hamsters.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this also moves into, the death of a grandparent, perhaps, or a family member, right? Do you ever compare things to nature, like every fall, the leaves fall and, anything like that? I don't
You
know.
can, depending on older children. There's actually a beautiful book called The Fall of Freddie the Leaf, which
Oh,
talks
yeah.
about death. From a leaf perspective, the leaf is green and blooming and it falls and then disintegrates and goes into the ground. It depends on the age of the child. Younger than age 5, that metaphor will not make sense to the child.
Hmm.
Um, Older children, elementary school age children might understand. It's still important that we explain death as a body stopping working. Um,
Okay.
because that's very matter of fact. Um, they might ask why or what happened, and then we might explain. Or death of a goldfish, death of a hamster, we might say, I don't know. Goldfish and hamster don't live as long as humans live. And so it's okay to then answer the question of we don't always know why things die, but it's important that regardless of our response, that we reiterate that death is final, and that that living being is no longer part of our physical world.
Right. Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay. What about when there is a change in your family, when there is a breakup, a divorce? How do you handle that?
Sure. So we know the divorce rate is at an all-time high. We know that changes in families happen. I have a lot of different chapters in the book to talk about different changes in families, whether
Okay.
it's divorce and separation, birth of a new child, military deployment, parental
Oh,
incarceration, drug abuse, alcohol abuse in the home.
yeah.
It's important that children have someone talk with them about what's happening.
Mm,
We can't make the assumption that children aren't noticing what's occurring. If we think about separation and divorce for young children, it is most important that the parents, hopefully together if they can, but if not separately, talk to the child and reiterate that you're still a family and that the love of the parent to the child is not impacted, nor did the child do anything to cause the change. Um, and we might say as adults, well, my child knows that they're loved and they didn't cause it. It is important that every child hear and be told that they did nothing to cause the divorce or separation. That actually transcends beyond the age in which my book addresses. But it's also important that young children have the reassurance of the love that they have with the parent. Young children will have questions about why. And again, matter of fact responses. Mommy loves you very much. Daddy loves you very much. And we've decided it's better for us to live in two separate homes. We're still a family. Um, and keeping it very matter of fact, it's not appropriate to share any of the intimate details that led to the divorce. Children don't need to be exposed to that at a young age. And we should really strive very hard to shield them from that. It's most important just to address it as a decision, a social decision, and a living decision. And then, if known, let the child know what's going to change in their world. So if we know, you're going to live at mom's house for a week and then dad's house for a week, but you can always call mom or dad from either house. You are still going to go to your same school, like reiterating to the child, what does this mean for them? And then again, reassuring the child of their love and their place in the family and the fact
mm.
that they did nothing to lead to the parental decision to separate or divorce.
It's really about coming back to that, really, as the most stability possible, that you anchor in that love and that dedication.
Correct, correct. And again, regardless of the emotional rifts that occur with separation and divorce, if parents can unite on that to have that conversation together, it's very powerful.
Mm,
And
yeah.
regardless of the separation and divorce reasoning, we know that generally speaking, both parents are firmly committed to ensuring the safety, security, and emotional well-being of their child. And so having the conversation together is ideal, if at all possible. Maybe with the third person present if there's a fear of emotion, but just being very united and having a unified but simple conversation with the child.
Yeah. And making sure the unified is the key piece that I'm pulling out as well, because we don't want to get into a place where we're cutting each other down and saying unkind things. That just creates more confusion, and just, we don't want to do that to our kids. It's just so not fair. And we know that as an adult, there's a price that our kids pay for that, as a child too, but even later on in life, it leaves a mark, and that's not fair. That's
That's
not fair.
absolutely right. And in the book, I talk as well about even after divorce and separation, things to be mindful of, like preparing yourself when the child comes home from mom's house and says, "We did something so fun," and there's kind of that feeling of disappointment of not being part of it, or even anger, but separating our own emotions from those of the child and
Yeah.
asking, "How did that make you feel?" And allowing ourselves to celebrate the child's experience and really separate ourselves from it.
Right.
Most parents, I probably all parents that go through divorce separation would say the child had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
And if we believe that, then ensure that the child feels that they had nothing to do with it. So when they
Mhm.
share positive things that happen in the opposite home, um, letting ourselves separate emotion and celebrate with the child and be part of that emotion, and not feeling the need to one up or put down the experience,
Yeah.
which is the adult's emotion, which should be kept separate.
Absolutely. And that's not easy. And that's not easy. And I like the first thing you said when I started asking you about the specific scenarios is to pause. I think that is a really good habit in so many situations, if not all. It's just, okay, take a second. Just take a second, gather your thoughts, center yourself, you know,
Sure.
notice what's going on with you, and then you proceed
And take
or
as
ask
long as
for
you need.
time. Or
That's exactly right. I tell the child, I'm going to answer your question. Give me a moment if I can. Or
yeah.
I'm going to go walk down the hallway and then I'm going to come right back and I'm going to have an answer for you. That's okay. The other thing I would say is oftentimes when we're talking to young children about the heavier adult topics, we might ask them how they're feeling or if they have other questions. The child might also need to have a pause. And so respect the silence. For some young children, we're going to ask that question and we're going to be met with silence. And that
Mm,
doesn't mean the child is ignoring us. It probably means just like we needed a second, they need to process what they were just told. I was
mhm.
just told that my family is going to change. I don't know how I feel yet, right? So give the
Yeah.
child moments to think through that, and don't
Mm,
feel the need to label for them. Let them take a few moments and then come back to us with a response.
mm. And I think, and tell me your thoughts on this too, is keeping the door open for future questions and conversation.
Absolutely. It's always important to check back with the child hours later, that night, the next day. I know we talked about, mom and dad divorcing. Do you have questions about that? Or I know the goldfish died 3 weeks ago. Do you want to talk about the goldfish? I mean, whatever it may be, allowing the child to know. The important thing is if we establish in the early childhood years that it is okay to ask questions and that
Mm,
that parent and that adult is going to honor, respect, and answer the question honestly, then when children continue to grow into pre-adolescence and adolescence and the questions don't become any easier, they just become even more adult, the child will still feel like that door is open to ask the questions. And that's what we as parents always want, to be a sounding board, to know what's happening in our child's lives. And we can establish that foundation early.
it's so important. And also to be that parent that they can always come to, no matter what, to talk to, and know that they're not going to be made fun of, they're not going to be judged or criticized or put down, that it's just like, look, you can come to me no matter what.
Right.
And I will respect you and I will honor you. And most importantly, respect you. Like if your child is coming to you, think about how that must be weighing on them,
Sure.
and then to be met with kindness and information versus, oh, just don't worry about that. You're too young to think about that.
Right.
Ouch. And I know I was treated like that, not just by my parents. I remember from teachers and different things like that. And it just leaves you feeling terrible. And
Right.
so it's an honor for your child to come to you and ask you this. I really believe that.
It is one of the most appropriate responses. The child that maybe comes and asks the question, did you know my goldfish died? What does that mean? Whatever the question is, a good response is, thank you for trusting me to ask that question.
Oh,
Because what the child is saying is, I don't know, but I believe and trust that you do. And I
yeah.
believe and trust that if I ask you, you're going to tell me. That's a huge statement of faith that the child is making, be it in a parent or any other adult in their life. It also buys you time, but thinking of thanking the child, because that way the child immediately says, oh, there's no shame in this. They're
Mhm.
appreciative that I asked questions. Great. If you can answer that question, I have more. But we should always answer those questions and we should seek that curiosity from our children.
It's so interesting that you say that. This is sort of a tangent a little bit, but I remember talking to somebody. She was a copywriter, and she has it looks like an adult son who's neurodivergent, and he kind of came in and said something, and I could see she was uncomfortable, like, oh geez, I wish she hadn't said that or whatever. Um, And I could see the stress on her face, right? And I just said to him, I said, well, thank you for telling me. And I'm not quite sure what he said. It didn't necessarily make any sense. And her whole demeanor changed. She was like, oh, you get it. And that was a really beautiful moment. So saying thank you, that's big. So we have another topic. And again, you have topics in this book. There's 40 of them, from illness to disasters to understanding gender. And you said parental incarceration. Thank you for addressing some of these subjects that I don't think are typical to address. And I think it's so helpful. It's like, here's a guide to all of the most uncomfortable questions you could ever be asked. And here's the answer on how to handle it in a really mature, thoughtful way that just helps your kids understand it. And even you make sense of it too, because I think it helps you to think through it too, right?
It does. It sure does.
Yeah. And so I want to say before I ask you this last question that you have for us in the Parent Toolbox a chapter synopsis, I think is what you would call it, or maybe you call it a little bit different, about a couple of these topics. One is the divorce and the other one is gun violence. So can you tell us a little bit about what you have for us in the Parent Toolbox?
Sure. So for any of these topics, we know that as a parent, it's important that we are prepared for the question. And so it's going to guide you through how to be prepared. What questions might a young child ask? And what are some appropriate responses? It's not a script, but appropriate responses that would make sense. The most important part is it then talks about developmentally, what might the child's follow-up questions be, or the unexpected response that the child might have. And the
Okay.
unexpected response is important because, again, young children lack social and emotional context. And so if we're prepared that, okay, when I tell my child this and I answer it, they might say that, I'm also prepared for the response. And so there's, again, a guide for every one of the topics that really guides us through how to help young children with these difficult conversations.
No, that is just fantastic. So wonderful. So that does lead me to my next question, which unfortunately is relevant, will be relevant no matter when you're listening to this. But let's talk about gun violence. How do we make sense of it to our kids and how do we explain it?
Yeah, it's a really important topic. Unfortunately, we continue to see instances of gun violence, and even in younger and younger age schools. And as much as we as adults try to shield children from it, and we should, young children are likely to be exposed to it. They're going to see pictures in magazines at grocery stores. They're going to hear reference to a school by name or, the shooting in a certain city. They're going to see emotion on the faces of their parents and loved ones when they are dropped off at school. But they're also likely going to be going through safety drills at the school in case they were ever in a similar situation, which is going to lead a lot of young children to ask questions such as, what happened at said location? Or my friend told me that there was a shooting. What does that mean? And so it's important that we as adults are prepared for that conversation. And unfortunately, as it happens more and more frequently, there's more likelihood that young children are going to hear about that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just a topic that nobody wants to talk about. And I think we all need some help in talking about it. So I just want to say thank you so much for addressing these big questions. And I love the idea of big conversations with little children. I love it so much. And every parent needs it. So where can people find your book?
Sure. So the best place is Amazon. Big Conversations with Little Children by Lauren Starnes. I also have a website, drlaurenstarnes.com, which will also link
Excellent.
you directly to ordering the book.
That's fantastic. And people can find you, and the Goddard School on all of the socials as well. Plus, the website is goddardschool.com. But Lauren, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for this work. I can't say thank you enough because we need this help. And there's just a lot of stuff going on in this world that's hard for us to make sense of, like I've said, and we just need the help. And it helps to sometimes just be spoon fed the information, instead of trying to figure it out for ourselves.
So true. Well, thank you, Robbin, for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this edition of my podcast, Parenting Our Future. I'm parent coach Robbin McManne, and if you're enjoying this podcast, please share it with someone who you think might also need to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe, and if you like my work, I would be grateful if you gave me a 5-star rating. For those of you who like my content and want more, visit me at yellingcurebook.com to get your copy of my book and to find other resources to help you. Until next time, I am wishing you and your family peace and